On the morning of December 4th, 1996, someone drove out to Tom M. Road in the Evans Crossroads community of Robeson County, North Carolina, and found a door that wasn't answered. The house belonged to Margaret Lois Bell. She was 45 years old. She lived alone. The kind of woman who kept her own hours and her own counsel, in a rural part of North Carolina where the roads were quiet and neighbors were not close. When no one could reach her that morning, someone went to check. What they found inside that house on Tom M. Road was the end of everything Margaret Bell had been, and the beginning of a question that would not be answered for nearly 3 decades. She had been stabbed. Multiple times. The wounds were not accidental, and they were not random. Someone had come into that house with intention, and Margaret Bell had died in the kind of violence that does not happen by accident, and does not happen between strangers who simply cross paths. This was personal. This was close. And whoever did it walked out of that house, got back into whatever vehicle they'd arrived in, and drove away from Evans Crossroads without leaving a single thing behind that could definitively put a name to what had happened in those rooms. Her name was Margaret Lois Bell. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a grandmother. She was someone who had built a life in the red clay soil of Robeson County, the kind of life that doesn't make the news until the day it ends badly. By the time December's cold had settled over the county and the first investigators had walked through her home and cataloged what was there and what was missing, Margaret Bell was already becoming what too many women in too many counties become after violence finds them in a quiet house on a rural road. She was becoming a file, a case number, a photograph on a shelf. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office and special agents from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation worked the scene. They gathered what could be gathered, they interviewed the people who needed to be interviewed, they followed the leads that presented themselves in the days immediately following December 4th. And through all of it, one name kept surfacing quietly in the corners of those conversations. Not as a confirmed suspect, not yet, but as a presence that the family could not stop thinking about. A shadow that fell over everything they tried to understand about what had happened to Margaret. His name was Kenneth Delton Locklear. He was 26 years old in December of 1996, and he was Margaret Bell's son-in-law. Before we go any further, there's something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed yet, and perhaps that wouldn't matter so much if these stories were just words. But they're not. They're pieces of stories, pieces of people, pieces of moments that changed lives forever. So if you found comfort, meaning, or even a little bit of yourself in these videos, please take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free and helps this community continue growing. And while you're here, I want to know, what feeling brought you to this video tonight? Let me know in the comments below. The family always felt it. That is the sentence that haunts every cold case that goes unsolved for years, for decades, for so long that the people who knew the victim grow old, waiting for confirmation of what they already understood in their bones. Margaret Bell's children and the people who loved her knew. They did not have evidence. They did not have a confession. They did not have anything that a courtroom would accept or a jury could weigh. What they had was the gut-level certainty that comes from knowing people. From watching who behaves strangely after a woman is murdered in her own home. From noticing who among the people in her orbit could not quite look you in the eye during the days that followed. Bell's daughter-in-law, Amy Dial, said it plainly when the arrest finally came in February of 2025. She said the family had felt for years that Locklear had something to do with it. Bell's son, Eric Dial, said the same. He said he always felt Locklear was involved. Those feelings are not evidence. Courts do not convict on feelings. But the family carried them anyway, for 28 years, the way you carry something that weighs more the longer you hold it. Robeson County, North Carolina is not a wealthy county. It is one of the poorest counties in the state, and it sits in a part of southeastern North Carolina where the Lumber River runs slow and brown through flatlands, and the communities spread out in clusters along rural routes with names that mean nothing to anyone who didn't grow up on them. Evans Crossroads is that kind of place. Tom M. Road is that kind of road. Margaret Bell's house was that kind of house. The kind that doesn't draw attention, the kind where a woman can live quietly, the kind where something terrible can happen, and the world outside barely flinches. The investigation moved through its early phases the way rural investigations often do. There was no surveillance footage. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. The physical evidence collected from the scene went to the laboratory, and the laboratory did what it could with what had been collected. And what came back was not enough to put a man in front of a jury and say with certainty, this is the person. The leads that investigators followed in the weeks and months after Margaret Bell's death did not hold up. The case slowed down. The file went onto a shelf in a building in Robeson County, and the years started moving in the way years do when answers do not come. Quickly, relentlessly, with no concern for the family still waiting on the other side of them. By the time the 1990s became the 2000s, Margaret Bell's murder was already a cold case. By the time the 2000s became the 2010s, it had been cold for more than a decade. The children she had raised grew older. The grandchildren she had held became children themselves. And Locklear, the man the family had always suspected, kept living. He remained in the Rowland community. He was not in prison. He was not a fugitive. He was not hiding. He was right there. The way people who have not been charged with anything are allowed to be, in the same county, on the same roads, breathing the same air. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office underwent a change in 2018. Bernice Wilkins was elected sheriff, and one of the things he did in the early period of his administration was establish a cold case investigation unit. It was built specifically for cases like Margaret Bell's, cases where the original investigation had done what it could with the tools it had, and time had moved on, and the files had gone quiet. The unit was staffed with retired law enforcement officers. They were not chasing new cases. They had one job: to go back into the archives, pull out the names that hadn't been spoken in years, and ask again whether something that hadn't been possible before was possible now. Margaret Bell's case was among the first they selected for review. They began looking at it in May of 2019. That is 22.5 years after the morning someone found her door unanswered on Tom M. Road. What the cold case team understood that the original investigators had been working without was the full weight of what DNA technology had become by 2019. In 1996, forensic DNA analysis existed, but it was nowhere near what it would become. The science had been developing for less than a decade at the time of Margaret Bell's murder. Profiles could be extracted from certain samples, but the databases were small, the techniques were limited, and what could be proven in a laboratory in 1996 was a fraction of what could be proven 2 decades later. Evidence that had yielded nothing in the original investigation might yield something entirely different if it was resubmitted in a world where the science had advanced by a generation. The cold case investigators went back through the evidence that had been collected and stored in December of 1996. They assessed what remained. They looked at what the original scene had produced and what the original laboratory testing had found, and they began the slow, methodical work of building a new path through old material. The family's suspicion about Kenneth Delton Locklear had never gone away. Investigators who reviewed the case would have seen what the original detectives had seen: a man connected to the victim by family, a man whose behavior had drawn attention, a man who had been in the orbit of Margaret Bell's life. Connecting that suspicion to provable, admissible, courtroom-grade fact was a different matter. In April of 2021, homicide investigators executed a search warrant. That search warrant allowed them to obtain a DNA sample from Kenneth Delton Locklear directly. Locklear was 51 years old by then. He had been living in Robeson County since the night Margaret Bell was killed in 1996. He had not been convicted of her murder. He had not been charged. He had not even been officially named a suspect in the years in between. But now investigators had his DNA. They submitted it, along with the evidence from the original crime scene, to the State Bureau of Investigation laboratory. And then, they waited. The laboratory is not a fast place. It cannot be. The science requires time, and there are many cases behind many doors waiting for the same careful attention. Investigators submitted the evidence and continued working the case in whatever ways they could while the laboratory did its work. Months passed, then more months, then a year, then 2 years. Then 3 years passed from the April 2021 submission, and the case was still waiting. On February 5, 2025, the state lab sent word that they needed something resubmitted. A piece of evidence needed to go back through. Investigators collected it and sent it back. The process ground forward. 8 days later, on February 13, 2025, the laboratory delivered its findings to Robeson County Sheriff's homicide investigators. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence at Margaret Bell's crime scene matched the DNA profile of Kenneth Delton Locklear. He was 55 years old. He had been living in the Roland community, a few miles from where Margaret Bell had died in 1996. He had been there the entire time. The next day, February 14, 2025, a Friday evening, deputies went to Locklear's residence. They arrested him at his home. The charge was first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Lois Bell. The arrest warrant read in plain legal language, "The defendant unlawfully, willfully, and feloniously did of malice aforethought kill and murder Margaret L. Bell." Plain language for the plainest and most final of facts. That same Friday evening, investigators went to the homes of Margaret Bell's children. They did not call. They knocked on doors and sat down with the people who had been waiting for 28 years and told them that the case had been solved. Amy Dial, Bell's daughter-in-law, described what that moment was like with 4 words that carry everything. She said it had been hard. For 28 years they had wondered, who did this? And now they knew. She said when the detectives came to the door that Friday night, she understood in an instant what it meant. She said it was a burden off her heart. Eric Dial, Margaret Bell's son, said the same thing differently. He said for years he had felt that Locklear had something to do with it. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way a person speaks when they have been carrying a truth for so long that the words for it have worn smooth. Sheriff Bernice Wilkins held a press conference on February 17, 2025. Family members were in the room. The words read into the public record on their behalf were the words of people who had stood in solidarity with the families of other victims for nearly 3 decades, who had supported the efforts of missing and murdered Indigenous women across the county and the state, who had known that their pain was not isolated, and that the wound left by Margaret Bell's death was part of something larger than one family on one road in one county. The statement said that no amount of searching could fill the void her absence had left, but that they stood that day with gratitude. Gratitude to the sheriff, to every investigator, to everyone who had kept working when keeping working was the only option left. Margaret Lois Bell's story does not end with tragedy, Wilkins said. It ends with justice. Those are the words a sheriff says at a press conference. They are also true. Kenneth Delton Locklear was held at the Robeson County Detention Center without bail after his arrest on February 14th. He remained there through February. He remained through March. He remained into April. And then, on a morning in April 2025, shortly after 2 a.m., detention center staff responded to a medical emergency involving Locklear at his cell. Detention officers and medical personnel began life-saving efforts immediately. The Robeson County Emergency Medical Services also responded. Their efforts did not succeed. Kenneth Delton Locklear was pronounced dead by medical personnel. He was 55 years old. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office requested the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to conduct an independent review of the circumstances of his death. An autopsy was ordered. The cause of death was subject to official determination, and Margaret Bell's family, who had waited 28 years for the system to deliver an answer, found themselves once again at the edge of something incomplete. A verdict that would never be read, a sentencing that would never happen, a courtroom reckoning that closed before it could fully open. That is how this case ends, not in a courtroom, not with a sentence, not with the kind of formal, documented, witnessed accountability that families sit through in hard wooden chairs and call justice. It ends with a man dying in a detention center 2 months after his arrest. It ends with an investigation that is now closed and a family that is left to define for themselves what the word closure means when the person charged with the murder of someone you loved does not live to face a jury. What does not end, what cannot end, is Margaret Bell herself, the woman who lived alone on Tom M. Road in the Evans Crossroads community and kept her own hours and her own life in the red flatlands of Robeson County. She was 45 years old. She was a daughter and a sister and a mother and a grandmother. She had people who called her name and kept calling it long after December 4th, 1996. Called it through years and decades and grandchildren growing up without knowing her. Called it in sheriff's offices and at press conferences and in living rooms on Friday evenings when detectives finally came to the door. She was not forgotten. That is not a small thing. In a county with too many unsolved cases and too many families waiting on too many shelves, the people who loved Margaret Bell refused to let her become only a file number. They kept asking. They kept calling. They carried what they knew in their bones for 28 years, and they were right. Her case became one of the first selected by a cold case unit that did not exist until 2018. Her evidence was resubmitted by investigators who were not yet born when she died. Her name was spoken at a press conference in 2025, with the same grief and the same fierce love it had been spoken with in 1996. She did not slip away. She was held. And her daughter, who had suspected the truth for nearly 3 decades, who had carried that weight through years of silence and frustration and grief, she got to be in that room in February 2025. She got to hear that the DNA matched. She got to feel, at least for a moment, what it is like when the thing you have always known is finally confirmed in a way the world can see. The floor held its secret for 28 years. The family never stopped standing on it, pressing down, demanding it give way. It finally did. Before this video ends completely, let me say one thing. More than 90% of people who watch these stories still haven't subscribed. If you enjoyed this story, if it touched a memory, a feeling, or a chapter of your life that still matters to you, I hope you'll subscribe and continue this journey with us. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What emotion are you leaving with after listening to these words? Let me know in the comments below.